As Kerry presented me, I'm part of the Bulgarian ecosystem. I've been over 20 years in the ecosystem. I've been over 4 mandates in the board of IBEST, which is our Association for Innovation, Business Services and Technology. And I have started FlowLogic with ambition to help transformation efforts going forward. So happy to share how we are looking to our journey towards becoming more and more relevant and keep on competitiveness around the sustainable sourcing as well. So Bulgaria has been on the sourcing map for over 2 decades already, and how it is going to continue to be relevant. Actually, it's been a journey. I look into that as a continuous journey, and how we keep on growing our skills, our experiences, and it is no simple formula that is going to make a click overnight, and how it is going to make it working for our future investors or companies that are going to find partnership in our country. So the baseline that we start with starts really from 2 decades ago, where we have the taxation framework, where we have already the bigger investors like Experian. I know you know that name, so it is one of our bigger investors in the sourcing there. We have many technology companies. We have grown our ecosystem with also startups in the country, including into the AI field over the past 2 years. So this is all providing a very, very solid baseline. Next to that is IBEST as an association that is making very solid bridges, and with the government for the right legislation, and with the universities and the secondary schools to make sure that we are growing the skill set for the future, and with peer associations like the British Bulgarian Chamber of Commerce, for example, and how we are all working in a competitive but still supportive mode that is going to provide the future outlook that will help the companies find the right talents. And I'm a believer of the no one size fits all, so we are never going to compete with India. We don't have the volume, we have completely different skill set, but it's important that, and thank you Kerry for providing the stage for that, it's important that the different spots on the map are known, because we can provide the advantage of being part of the EU, and there we are completely compliant with the EU regulation, especially when it comes to ESG. This is the famous CS3D directive that has entered into force 2 years ago, and that all the companies above 200 employees are obliged to start reporting on by the end of this year. After 2 years, all the companies with employees above a number of 50 will start reporting and must be compliant to that as well. And next to that is actually coming the mentality and the culture we could build over the years, starting with the CSR initiatives many years ago. Lots of the sourced companies in our country do measure and do report unobliged on an annual basis on that. So we are able to say approximately on the hours of impact, on the money of impact. There are tens of NGOs that are supporting on the education, on the inclusion, on counting what type of diversity we are actually implementing on a daily basis. And last but not least is our labor legislation. For good or for bad, we inherited that from the socialistic time. However, there are a lot of social elements starting from 1967. This is when our labor code was actually established. And it kept on growing, but it presupposes that every employer in our country takes good care of the people, cannot abuse of the kids' labor, thus provides the proper time for women to give birth and to take care of the kids for a decent number of months if they wish to. But then next to that, we have upgraded it in the last few years, where all the companies are now obliged to provide 4% of their jobs to a disabled people. So these are all elements that keep on growing slowly but steadily, and then put all together in a system actually makes it a very decent place to partner with. And I'm happy to provide more information going forward. So I'll stay through the rest of the day. I'll join the gallery dinner as well, and I'm happy to meet as many of you as possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maya. Right. Yes, yeah. Rajiv, just give us a flavour on how environmentally, socially friendly Sri Lanka is.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry, and good seeing most of you guys because I missed a few of these events. So I come from Sri Lanka, and if most of you are not familiar with the country, whoever that loves tea would know Ceylon tea. So I'm the CEO and a co-founder of a software company based out of Sri Lanka. As Kerry mentioned, in Sri Lanka, /com works very closely with the GSA. We are a island nation just south of India, but I think something that most of you would know about the country is mainly based on the ones who are fans of cricket. It's a country that loves cricket, but also over the last few years, Sri Lanka has done very well to stay resilient despite the pandemic, and a country that was kind of known for the wrong reasons on the economic downfall. But IT industry remained quite resilient. I don't think we missed a heartbeat when it came to service delivery despite these challenges. So the few things that I would like to share are those that are already perhaps published, and I think GSA has awarded Sri Lanka as the outsourcing destination of the year 3 times, right? So I think that speaks volumes for the country that has not yet been seen as a potential destination for outsourcing. And I think Sri Lanka, for me, is not a country that you'd want to generally, as Maya mentioned, is associated with the quantity. I think it's associated with the quality of service, because most of the countries that I know that are working in Sri Lanka are generally those who have their product development arms based out of Sri Lanka. So if you look at some of the English or the British companies, London Stock Exchange is one of those highly regulated companies that demand for high availability, high performance, who have got a Sri Lankan company that's powering its exchange. And you've got other companies such as Google, Microsoft, and some of these companies who've got their development arms in Sri Lanka. So if I have to just go through some of the stats based on the recent findings, if you look at the cities that are in Asia that are ranked in terms of its quality and availability of infrastructure, not to single out a few countries, but based on the reports that I have, in terms of the global competitiveness index, in terms of infrastructure, Sri Lanka was ranked number 61 compared to India, which was 70, and Bangladesh 114. And if you look at healthcare infrastructure, where Sri Lankan healthcare is generally free healthcare, Sri Lanka was ranked 43rd compared to a few other Asian countries. And if you look at our mobile penetration, the use of infrastructure, availability of infrastructure, you'd notice that all Sri Lankans generally have good access to internet. So most of the companies that are set up in Sri Lanka generally are quite happy and satisfied with its infrastructure, because not only that we have 100% electricity that is completely covering the country, but in terms of single points of failure, whether it's internet availability, you don't have any single points of failure. So it's an untapped destination, as Maya said about her country. I think it's an untapped destination for most countries to, or companies to look at setting themselves up in Sri Lanka. And from a legislation point of view, we've got coded legislation. It's not unwritten law. So you could expect, you know exactly what to expect in terms of legislation. In terms of tax, I think you have tax incentives. So my company, we have completely 100% dollar earning businesses. So most of my clients are in the US and Europe. So we don't have any taxes that we are facing as a result of that. In terms of modern infrastructure, so Sri Lanka set up a new city called the Port City, where again there are tax incentives being extended to those countries or companies who would like to invest in the country. And I think one of the resilient countries that you would have heard of through the pandemic was Sri Lanka, because I think Kerry knows this, during the time when most countries were really suffering because of the fuel shortages, Sri Lanka came up with a QR code which allowed for us to kind of get rid of all the fuel queues. And one of the only countries that I know at least that successfully rolled out something within a few weeks. So despite all what you heard, I think we've had a bit of a negative image created about the country. No thanks to the ones who are in power, but I think as people, we've gone through a lot, and we've kind of managed to get through it all simply because of how IT has come to the fore and helped keep things together. And I think you'd start hearing a lot of good news about the country, because if you look at some of these rankings, these rankings were done recently because they felt that Sri Lanka has untapped potential. In terms of ESG, and I think we spoke about it earlier, Sri Lanka generally has remained committed to its ESG policies. If you look at most of the companies, they are already embracing ESG. We already do GRI reporting, right? And if you look at not only the IT sector, but also the apparel sector, there's something called the Higgs Index, which gives you a measurement of how your environmental and social aspects are rolled out to its employees. Sri Lanka is ranked quite high. It's because if you look at the machine operators who are working in these factories, most of them generally are paid better salaries than what is expected through law. So Sri Lanka generally is a country that's known to embrace ESG because it's not just about seeing it as a cost, but they see it as an investment to attract new clients, but also as a way of future-proofing the country. Living in an island nation, sometimes, you got to think of your future because you do have limited resources. But more importantly, I think it's a country that generally embraces innovation. We are quite good at product development as opposed to services, but at the same time, we've been successful in having good companies setting themselves up in Sri Lanka. HSBC has a big entity in Sri Lanka. London Stock Exchange has. E&Y recently set up a big company in Sri Lanka because they felt that Sri Lanka does remain committed to its product development. So I'm sure there'll be a few other questions towards the latter part of this panel discussion, so I'll hand it over to my colleague.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, we're going to hear from Hiran next, and then we'll go into a conversation. So if you've got any questions, you start thinking about them. But Hiran, to you first.
Thank you, Kerry. Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about Mauritius. I'm sure that some of you have heard about Mauritius, probably for vacation, for holidays, beautiful beaches, Blue Lagoon. So very nice place to take vacation. But Mauritius is much more than beaches and beautiful hotels, great hotels. Mauritius, for those who haven't been or who don't know about Mauritius, is a small island in the Indian Ocean, closer to Africa, Madagascar and Africa. Some 1.3 million population, so not a very big country. But Mauritius was formerly a French colony, then became a British colony, and we gained independence from Britain in 1968. And at that time, Mauritius was a very poor country, $200 GDP per capita, only one economic sector, which was sugarcane. But 50 years later, today in 2024, Mauritius has achieved a highly remarkable economic performance. Today, the GDP per capita for Mauritius is nearly $11,000. Mauritius has over 12 economic sectors contributing to its development. And Mauritius now is classified as an upper middle income economy. So from these 12 economic sectors, we have today, obviously, agro-industry, manufacturing, financial services, logistics, real estate, which is booming, and the ICT BPO industry, which is now a very important industry in Mauritius. So Mauritius is a great BPO location. And today, the ICT BPO industry in Mauritius contributes to nearly 8% of the GDP of Mauritius. In 2023, the industry in Mauritius witnessed nearly 6% of growth. And today we have over 900 firms operating in the ICT BPO in Mauritius. And we've got firms coming from everywhere over the world. US firms, for instance, Concentrix, in France, Accenture in Mauritius, from Britain, SD Works, EcoVadis, most of you know about EcoVadis, who's present in Mauritius. So this is a real booming industry in Mauritius. But coming back to the ESG initiatives, well, Mauritius, as I said, is a touristic island. So Mauritius, being a small island, is very vulnerable to climate change, clearly. So we started quite early in the start of the 21st century about looking into the impact of climate change in Mauritius. So we started very early with a number of initiatives how to ensure that we can bring initiatives, policies, legislation to ensure that Mauritius can mitigate the risks and impact of climate change. So at the very early stage, at government level, we started with the setting up of a CSR tax, which was imposed on all private firms. So it was 2% of your profits. And with this tax, the private companies had to create a CSR fund. And with this CSR fund, they had to invest in a number of, I would say, social, environmental, and governance activities. So that was the very early start. And the good thing is that at that time, they were quite reluctant, obviously. And what government did at that time, he said, okay, if you don't spend your CSR fund in community project, environmental project, or training of your labor, then you will have to give the remaining of your fund to the fiscal authorities. So this ensured that private sector started a number of initiatives. And then today now, there have been a number of initiatives which have been launched. And in 2022, government decided to come up with a more integrated approach. This is the integrated ESG framework that Mauritius has launched in 2022, and which is partly financed by the African Development Bank. So this idea of having an integrated ESG framework is to ensure that we have a coherent way in terms of our way forward. So today, in terms of environment, government has already established a number of laws, for instance, in terms of recycling, reuse, repair, in terms of waste management. We know that in the IT BPO industry, there's a lot of electronic waste, for instance. So what do we do about our electronic waste? And we know that the life cycle of electronic equipment is quite low, 5 years, even now or less today. So how do we manage about this, especially for a small island where land is quite limited? So initiatives have been launched around this. About the impact on energy. So energy transition is a major issue in Mauritius. So government has stated the objective that by 2030 we should reach 60% of renewable energy in terms of our energy production. And we have set up a number of programs, policies and incentives to ensure that the private sector also can move towards renewable energy. And this is now accelerating quite fast. Into the social part of it, which is very important, inclusiveness is absolutely central and key to the strategy of the development of Mauritius. So how to ensure that we have good labor laws. We have laws which ensure that there is parity for gender issues. That's very important. How do we ensure that there is a good salary which is paid? And for instance, Mauritius has introduced recently now a minimum salary to ensure that everyone can have a decent living. So this obviously has increased the cost of operations in Mauritius, but it has created more quality, obviously. And in terms of the rating of our location at the international level, this has brought up the profile of Mauritius. And last, about governance. Governance is also fundamental, clearly. And apart from this corporate social responsibility, in terms of governance, Mauritius has ensured that the private sector now becomes more the, I would say, the driving force behind it. And the private sector now, through its apex body, which is Business Mauritius, which represents all the private sector associations, the Business Mauritius has created its own specific corporate governance framework, which is now being applied to all private firms. So this has lifted clearly the level in terms of the ESG initiatives. So we are in Mauritius, we are fully committed to this, and clearly we can see it now in the rankings. For instance, the 2023 Kearney index. We see that Mauritius is ranked 32 out of the 78 countries, I think, which is assessed. So clearly we are climbing up the ladder, and this is bringing more quality firms also using Mauritius as a BPO location. So there are many other advantages which obviously I won't go into in terms of attractiveness of the doing business, in terms of taxation in Mauritius, in terms of the cost of doing business. So, but clearly Mauritius, for those who don't know Mauritius, well, it's a great place to live, obviously, but it's also a great place to work now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, thank you. So 3 very different geographies from all around the world. So I guess my first question, and it really has to go back to Graham's presentation first thing this morning, is, is applying the ESG lens. What are you doing for all of the companies within your countries to ensure they themselves are more sustainable in their performance?
Yeah, I'll start for Bulgaria. Actually, this morning's presentation gave me a very fruitful thinking that we can increase the collaboration also through the GTMBC Council, but representing this Formiga initiative. What's the idea behind this formation, and how we can potentially bridge and start using some kind of standardization like that, because at company level, I think that every company are doing their own thing. At an industry level, there is definitely room for improvement. So that's one taking home for me topic.
Well, I think this one should deserve a round of applause, because I think SLASCOM and the government of Sri Lanka, we are targeting to be the first 100% green IT BPM industry in the world by 2030. Yeah. And I think for me, and how we are trying to accomplish it is also by having a few, we are trying to encourage the startups. We have something called the Start Right concept, where we are trying to encourage the startups also to start thinking about it from day one, as opposed to it being an afterthought. So I think we've started rolling out some of these initiatives, given that we've seen the value it creates, not necessarily because it's a tick in the box kind of thing for us as well in Sri Lanka. We see the value it creates, and trying to be 100% green by 2030, I think, is a good ambition. That's something that the industry has signed up, and we're all committed to achieving as an industry. So some of the things that we've done in the recent past have also been around educating these companies and seeing the value of it, as well as making sure that those measurements are in place. So some of what we talked about earlier, standardization, if you look at most of the companies in Sri Lanka have embraced ISO 20,000, 27,000, 31,000, 22,000 and 14,000 in some way or the other. Not only the IT industry, I think credit must go to the apparel industry that have led from the front. So IT industry is not only kind of maintaining its course in being on track to get in there, but also trying to show the way for the rest of the industries. Equally importantly, the government has also kind of embarked on a mission to ensure that we don't just make it a one-off thing for one industry, but all industries look at it. So I think as a country, the emphasis is on ESG, is about not not only the ESG side of it. I think people look at ESG as more of a corporate agenda. But I think, Sri Lanka also looks at the UN Sustainability Development Goals and seeing how we can, provide some kind of attractiveness in terms of both ESG and UN Sustainability Development Goals as those that we are focused on. One thing I must also tell you is, if you look at some of the recent achievements, I think Sri Lanka has done quite well to look at technology being used to also track, and not just to kind of say that we are complying to it. Using blockchain, I think most of the Sri Lankan companies have started looking at how can we show the world that we are truly embracing ESG in terms of how carbon emissions are being managed, and how socially we are being conscious about inclusivity. And in terms of governance, there's a lot of emphasis being placed to certify companies who are adhering to the best practices when it comes to governance. So I think a lot is being done, and I think as a country we are doing the best we can to kind of be up there with the rest.
Well, I'd say being net zero by 2030 as an industry is something massively to applaud, and something that you should be sharing back with us so that we can actually, achieve a target.
I think you might see some good progress being made, and we're tracking it. We are not just trying to wait till 2030 to see whether we've got to. We are doing it on an annual basis to try and see how closer we are to being, 100% green.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. Right, do we have any questions from the floor for any of the delivery destinations, or any observations? Come on, somebody must have something.
I'll perhaps stir something up by asking you all, at the end of the day, I know we are looking at some of these standardizations and ESGs. For me, I think, most of the companies generally still look at the top line and the bottom line, right? It's not to say that, these should be given second priority, but I think you must look at these different destinations as a way of also having kind of a business continuity arrangement. And I think if you look at some of the destinations that all three of us are offering, I think there are plenty of other destinations, but I think you got to look at diversifying your supply chain as well. So for instance, in my company, we've got offices not only in Sri Lanka. We are looking at ourselves having satellite offices in the rest of the region, to make sure that we are not just a place where the single point of failure, even if it's set up in Sri Lanka. So we are looking at sourcing our resources from other parts of the region as well. So I think it makes sense, not only from an ESG point of view or looking at some of these indexes, but also from a business point of view, which is to try and grow your presence in the region, because these regions are growing in terms of the market as well, but also to try and be more cost efficient. Because one thing that I think we are successful is, if you look at the European and the American countries, it's very difficult to become ESG compliant on day one, because there's a lot being invested in fossil fuel and most of those. But whereas some of these destinations, we are able to kind of get ahead, because on day one itself we can start off on that right foot. So it makes sense for you to look at those destinations as, possible places to sort of come.
Terry.
Yeah, I had a question. So we heard at the beginning from John Lewis about using ESG credentials as a selection mechanism for where they outsource to. And then obviously we heard about the ESG assessment, standard assessment to be able to measure performance. I just wondered, from your perspective, are you seeing buyers assess your ESG performance as part of their selection process? Are you positively seeing that happen?
Sorry.
Yeah, definitely yes. In the case of Mauritius, we are seeing it a lot. Always questions coming about our ESG policies, not only at government level, but also at the level of the private firms. And this is why I think the discussion on standardization is absolutely critical, because standardization brings something which we believe is very important, is about transparency. Because when you standardize, you have a common way of saying things. For instance, if I take an example in the case of Mauritius, all companies which are listed on the stock exchange of Mauritius, they have to comply to a ruling of the stock exchange. When they submit their interim reports, they have to report on their ESG initiatives. So that's mandatory now for all those who are listed. But now what's happening is that this initiative is being used by all firms when they are sharing their annual reports, for instance. So everyone is sharing about their ESG initiatives. And we can see it also in terms of the different developments. If I take the real estate sector or the tourism sector, they are more and more going towards international recognized standards. For instance, the LEED certification or the BREEAM certification for real estate. So standardization, I think, is absolutely key to this, because it brings everyone to the same level of understanding of what we are talking about.
For me, SPSI all the way, yeah.
Yeah, for Bulgaria, what I can comment is that from the ENTS and the G, more the social and the governance aspect are really required as a standard nowadays, much less the green aspect. The green aspect is more taken care of from the supplier point of view, starting with office buildings, that now all the A-class office buildings do take the green certificate as well, and this is put as a label. There are all of green initiatives, but they're more people-driven, not on a contractual level that much.
I think the simple answer is yes, and I think one of the reasons for that is also because most of the, most of the big players are looking for those who are compliant, so they can piggyback on those successes. Example, on the carbon neutral, or in the case of most of these countries are carbon negative. As a result, they are able to buy back some of those, carbon credits and basically, report that they have indeed become carbon neutral, right? And most of these companies do look at ESG compliant companies in these regions, knowing that they can actually use those credentials to their advantage. I hope it's more than just kind of ticking the boxes, but then the reality is it does help.
Right, just one closing remark, and I'm going to give it to you here. And that stat that you gave me when we were talking in the break as to what your emissions are versus the impact it's having on you.
Mauritius, small island, obviously, in terms of our carbon emission, Mauritius contributes to less than 0.001% of carbon emissions globally. So it's absolutely negligible. But the problem is that we are facing around 1,000% of the impact of what's happening in terms of climate change or all the changes that we are seeing. So it's absolutely huge. And when we look now at the budget, the investment that a small country, small island has to put into this transition, it's huge. But as I said to Kerry earlier, we have always been optimistic in the past, and we are still today. We believe that we are on the right track. And from what I've heard this morning, clearly there are so many interesting things and interesting policies, ideas that can be implemented. So clearly it's the way forward, and hopefully, which I hope, coming back to your question about whether firms or providers, they are asking questions about ESG policies in the destination. I just hope it's not just only about their own reputation, because today it's about reputation. You can see all sorts of window dressing just to make sure that they can say in their report that, okay, we've gone to a country which meets ESG standards. I think it should mean much more than this. And what I mean by this is that it should be a two-way. It should not be just firms coming to a location and say, okay, you are low cost, or you have certain infrastructure, and then we can set up there. there should be a transfer of knowledge, a transfer of know-how, which can help to uplift also the country.
Absolutely. So I'm hoping that you guys, now that you've met each other, will do a transfer of knowledge between yourselves as to what your delivery destinations are doing. So thank you very much for joining us, and please do stay on the network for the rest of the day. Thank you. Right, we've got one last pop-up panel session before lunch, so we'll move very swiftly on to that, and I'd like to invite our ESG ambassadors. These are organisations that we know are doing some really interesting, cool stuff with ESG. So Matt Clark, Managing Director at Workforce Solutions for ADEC, Dimitar Dimitrov from Acedia, and Simon Howitson from Born Good. Welcome to the stage.